In just the past few months, cyber attacks have frozen a major oil pipeline, shut down the world's biggest meat producer, and compromised one of the largest email servers in the world. In a June 6th interview, Secretary of Energy Jennifer Granholm said, and I'll quote her, "There are thousands of cyber attacks in all aspects of the energy sector." And she added, "It's happening all the time." Secretary Granholm also acknowledged that our adversaries, foreign nations and criminal groups, have the cyber capabilities to shut down the U.S. electrical grid. We know that this threat exists because our adversaries have demonstrated it already. In 2015, Russian intelligence agents used a sophisticated cyber attack to cripple industrial control systems of the Ukrainian electrical grid, shutting off power to hundreds of thousands of people in the dead of winter. In that case, thankfully, power was restored to most consumers in a matter of hours. However, the message was clear. Russia is willing and able to target its adversaries' electrical infrastructure. But it's not just Russia that we need to worry about. China, Iran, North Korea, and numerous sophisticated cyber criminal groups all view the U.S. electrical grid as a priority target. So, Mr. Goldstein, how would you describe the current risk of a major cyber incident on the electrical grid in the near future? Give me a sort of a landscape assessment of where do you think we are right now, to the best of your ability.
Certainly, Mr. Chairman. I think your description of the threat environment is apt. I think we have an environment today where there are many organizations throughout this country and across sectors of critical infrastructure that have not universally deployed these sort of strong security controls and manage known security weaknesses that we know that our adversaries have the intent and capability to exploit. This puts us in a position where the possibility of a highly damaging cybersecurity intrusion affecting a national critical function, such as the provision of power to the American people, is certainly a possibility.
Let me ask you, just on that point, and this is for the entire panel. I doubt very much that we have a single point of failure, but as we saw with the Colonial Pipeline, you've got some infrastructure that some pieces of infrastructure that are so critical to, in that case it was the East Coast, but is this an assessment that there are several points of vulnerability, or geographically speaking? And when you say certain entities are not using proper cyber hygiene, let's say, is that something that, as Mr. McClellan has pointed out, is that a standard that's recommended, or is it something that is actually required?
Certainly. So I will defer to my colleagues at DOE and at FERC respectively for an assessment on points of failure in the grid, as well as on the mechanisms that could be utilized through FERC authorities. What I would note is that if all organizations do not urgently focus on understanding not only the vulnerabilities in their networks that exist today, but also on the tactics, techniques, and procedures that we are seeing adversaries, whether nation states or criminal gangs, utilize, and don't urgently invest in putting in place controls that meet what we see our adversaries doing, then we are at urgent risk of a cybersecurity intrusion that could result in degradation of a national critical function, of which there are many, but certainly the energy sector is one. This is why it is so urgent for all organizations to put cybersecurity investments at the top of their list, recognizing that investments must be weighed against other considerations. But at Cisa, we are urgently focused on making sure that all entities across critical infrastructure are focused on putting in place these strong controls and mitigating these known vulnerabilities that we know could be exploited to cause significant harm.
I'm sorry, Mr. Kumar and Mr. McClellan, could you take a whack at that question as well?
Absolutely, sir. Thank you for the question. I think that's a really important question because I truly do believe that the cyber challenge is the national security challenge that we're facing on a daily basis, as you mentioned. It becomes even more complex when you think of the electricity sector that has over 3,000 electric utilities across the United States and how it's all connected. This becomes even more complex and challenging, and so we need to be addressing this through three different ways. The department is looking at it from three different tracks. One, What are those policies that we need to look at? And those policies in coordination with our colleagues at FERC. 2, what are tools and technologies that we can put on the grid that can detect these threats before they result in impacts? And we need to continue investing in a lot of that R&D. But then the last one is, when it does happen, just like a colonial, how do we respond? Respond swiftly and have the backups necessary to immediately recover from a response. We are thinking about it from all 3 perspectives, and we need to continue to do more. And so we at the department are certainly working with FERC in terms of really understanding the bulk power system. So how do we help the regulators at the federal level understand the threats so that our standards are risk-based? So as we see the threat evolve, so does the standard. We're doing the same thing with the states. So the jurisdiction of regulatory standards for the distribution systems are in the hands of states. And so our approach at the department is to work with the public utility commissions and the public service commissions at the state level to ensure that they, number 1, understand the threat. As my colleague Joe mentioned, what we're trying to do is help them understand the threat at both the unclassified and classified level to inform how they work with their utilities at the state level. The second thing is often a lot of the states don't have the resources to actually make these informed decisions in terms of how much a cybersecurity investment is appropriate. So what we've been doing is developing tools. So the tool I just mentioned, C2M2, the Cybersecurity Capability Maturity Model, utilities use to decide on investments in cybersecurity. We are providing a similar version of that tool to the states to use to gauge the cybersecurity of the utilities within their state. And so we need to do this 3-pronged approach to continue pushing cybersecurity forward, sir.
Great. Mr. McClellan?
Refer to a couple of quick quotes from the annual threat assessment. This was issued in April 9th of 2021. We continue to assess that China can launch cyber attacks that at a minimum can cause localized temporary disruption to critical infrastructure within the United States. Regarding Russia, Russia continues to target critical infrastructure, including underwater cables and industrial control systems in the United States and in its allied countries. As compromising such infrastructure improves and in some cases can demonstrate its ability to damage infrastructure during a crisis. And then lastly, I just refer you to the Task Force on Cyber Deterrence. This was in 2017, and this is just a precursor to your answer. So the first, major powers, Russia and China, have a significant and growing ability to hold U.S. critical infrastructure at risk via cyber attack. This emerging situation threatens to place the United States in an untenable position, although progress is being made to reduce the pervasive cyber vulnerabilities of U.S. critical infrastructure. The unfortunate reality is, at least for the next decade, the offensive cyber capabilities of our most capable adversaries are likely to far exceed the United States' ability to defend key critical infrastructures. So back to my statement, my opening statement, FERC uses a dual-fold approach. If you imagine 2 geometric shapes, a pyramid, foundationally, that's where we put the cybersecurity standards. These standards are developed in the open, and they're deliberative, and they're iterative. Our adversaries are capable of reading the standards and adapting the standards even before they're put into place, which is spoken to by our intelligence community assessments. However, at the apex of the pyramid, that's where the nation-state threats lie. It's a matter of information sharing between the agencies and between the industry to make certain that they can address these threats. And those threats really, I see the time.
All right, yeah, thank you. Chair now recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Grothman, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you. Kind of what you said there, Mr. McClellan, is kind of a little bit scary. So you feel today that our grid is vulnerable. I think most people probably think it is, but do you think it's significantly vulnerable to cyber attack?
I would say that the worldwide threat assessment from DNI, the current threat assessment, says that our adversaries have the capability to target and disrupt these services.
Okay, I think our cyber posture is 3 parts. It's defense, it's response, and reaction. If there were a successful attack on a significant part of the United States, do we have a fallback position, or how quickly do you think we could get back our grid?
I think that depends on the attack. You know, was infrastructure simply interrupted? Were their services interrupted, such as a denial of service attack? Or were the adversaries able to gain access to the networks and in particularly the operational technology networks, and at that point, damage or destroy equipment that's necessary to operate the power grid.
That's kind of the question. If they damage equipment, do we have fallback position here? Would we have to build something new? I mean, what would happen if part of the grid you pick, part of the United States, is destroyed or disabled? How long would you be able to, before we'd be able to get the grid up and going again?
The industry does operate to an N-1 contingency, which means that it can suffer the single largest contingency on the grid and continue operations. So it can continue to provide power if it loses the single largest contingency. If there are multiple contingencies, those can result in prolonged outages, and those outages depend on the extent of damage to the equipment and the availability of that equipment.
Okay, so you feel one attack, we always have enough backup, but more than that, we could have big trouble?
I'm sorry, would you repeat?
You feel we have enough to handle one attack without being a disaster, but we get more than one, we have huge trouble. Is that accurate?
If it's beyond an N-1 contingency, then the power grid service can be interrupted. That is correct.
Okay, Mr. Goldstein, do you agree with that, or do you want to comment on the same questions?
Sir, I'll defer to my colleagues in Nerc and DOE for their assessment of the resilience of the grid itself.
Okay, Mr. Kumar, you.
Thank you for the question, sir. So there's both a benefit and a concern when you have 3,000 electric utilities in the United States. The concern is certainly the complex nature of how it is all connected and how we need to ensure that the cybersecurity posture across the board is raised up. But that complexity is also its resiliency because of the different types of networks that are set up across the different utilities. What you can also have is some sort of resiliency built in because it's not going to be able to go traverse from one utility to the next as easily. With that said, to answer your question more specifically, the concern that I have is more focused around supply chain threats. So much like we saw with solar winds, where it took one supplier that was across 16,000 organizations, that's the threat that I'm concerned about, and that's where I'm focused on, is what are those critical components, critical manufacturers and suppliers that are across the energy sector? And if they are impacted, then they can actually be the attack vector into these utilities. So that's where a lot of my concern is right now in terms of addressing the supply chain threat, sir.
Do you feel we have enough defense right now to prevent that, or no?
In terms of the perspective we have is currently the assessment that my colleague from FERC mentioned is we think that there is the capability to have a temporary and localized disruption to energy supply per the DNI's assessment. But in terms of the resiliency, I do think the sector does have resiliency built in. The N-1 criteria that Joe mentioned is really important. But in terms of what we do right now is we practice the response. So if this were to happen, how do we get either a spare transformer in or another piece of equipment quickly in? So that's something that we are constantly doing with the sector in terms of preparing for that type of incident.
I understand you might not be able to speak to this, but I want it on the record that it's important we don't let malign actors get away with these actions, especially if they're affiliated with nation states like Russia or China. If something happened like you were describing, how quickly do you think we would be able to, say one utility had huge problems, how quickly do you think we'd be able to get the grid in that area or that factory up and running again?
Sure, thank you for that question. It's a complex problem. It really depends on the type of attack vector, right? Is it a piece of software that's critically used? Is it a piece of hardware? And that's going to factor into how we respond as a government to really respond to this type of incident. Unfortunately, there isn't a great answer until you start to see it. Now, with the solar winds type of incident, what we're focusing on is working with the GEs, the ABBs, the large industrial control system manufacturers to ensure that there is backups and redundancy built into these systems so that we can go to a backup plan. And so that's an area that we've been working with this sector on, and the concept is called spare tire. Can we go to a manual mode if we can't rely on our digital systems?
it seems to me that private companies, if there were not threat of attack, would not invest as much as they have to if there was an attack, right? It seems the question is for good of society as all, we need a fallback position. Do you think there's some role for government there or not?
Sir, I appreciate the question. I feel like government does have a role in terms of really working with the sector to bolster their defenses. This is why we launched the Industrial Control Systems Initiative, because we really need to start looking at cyber adversaries in those critical systems and then be able to correlate that information. From our end, we want to correlate it with our colleagues at Cisa from a cross-sector perspective, and then we want to correlate it with our intelligence community so that we can get a feedback loop back to the sector. And we need to continue pushing on this and incentivizing cybersecurity across the board.
I'd like to thank the chair for his generosity.
Absolutely. The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Wells, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses, too. The National Institute of Standards and Technology cybersecurity framework includes guidance and best practices that are, of course, widely regarded as foundational elements. Mr. McClellan, why do the North American Electric Reliability Corporation standards not fully integrate the NIST cybersecurity framework?
Thank you for the question. In August of 2019, GAO submitted a report to Congress comparing the Nerc SIP standards to the NIST framework. In that report, GAO concluded that the SIP standards did not cover some of the NIST framework requirements. In response to that report, FERC staff began an investigation to benchmark the Nerc SIP standards against the GAO framework. It's important to note right at the onset that the two bodies don't necessarily compare equally. And just a few examples. The Nerc SIP standards focus specifically on operational technologies necessary to ensure operations of the bulk power system, where the NIST framework focuses on both IT, information technology, and OT, operational technology. The Nerc SIP standards do not necessarily reflect best practices. They're foundational standards and they're foundational practices.
So what do we have to do in order to get to a place where we have some confidence that we'll be able to resist these attacks?
So FERC, after the analysis, FERC did issue a notice of inquiry. It was in June of 2020. It specifically identified categories of function to the industry for open comment, asking whether or not the NERC SIP standards could be improved in comparison to the NIST framework.
So what do you think? I mean, do you believe the gaps in the current reliability standards do present a risk to the bulk electrical system?
The comments were received, so I just need to finish that quickly. So in September, we received comments. Now it's the subject of an ongoing proceeding, so I can't speak any further about it. But I can tell you that the matter is under active consideration by the Commission, having received comments from any interested party in comparing the NERC SIP standards to the NIST framework.
The bottom line, though, is that we really got to get some resolution on that in order to have a higher degree of confidence that we can resist a cyber attack, right?
Again, I just cannot comment on an ongoing proceeding. I couldn't give any perspective on that proceeding. I'm sorry, sir.
Well, let me ask this. On the NERC reliability standards, as I understand it, they're only mandatory for bulk power systems of over 1,500 megawatts of power. And there's some possibility that there could be a number of attacks that are on separate systems, but the aggregate can well be over 1,500 megawatts, and we don't have the information about how we would resist that attack. Does FERC now have any information, and has the agency assessed the impact of a cyber attack on geographically dispersed power systems?
Yes, that's another matter that's under active consideration at FERC. Again, it's the content of an internal deliberation, so I can't speak to it. But it is an important aspect, and FERC has identified that as such.
So where do we need to be to improve our confidence about our capacity to protect the grid? I mean, we've got to get to the bottom of these questions, right?
Right. And these are subjects of active proceedings at FERC.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Gentlemen. I yield back.
Just to, I'm a little bit frustrated that we can't get at these answers because we have a proceeding elsewhere. What's the nature of your the privilege that you're claiming here?
As an active proceeding, one that's under deliberation, as a staff member, I cannot comment on the merits and the timing of that active proceeding, and this is an
I think he was asking you about a certain proceeding. He was asking you about how to protect the power grid for the country.
It was in comparison, for instance, to the Nerc, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, it was in comparing the Nerc SIP standards to the NIST framework, and this is an active proceeding at the commission. It's under deliberation.
So if we went into classified session, would you be able to discuss it then?
I could not, Mr. Chairman, because the content and timing of a deliberation at FERC cannot be disclosed.
Okay, we're going to have you back then. The chair recognizes the gentleman. I apologize to the gentleman that it was not fruitful.
No, you better stated my puzzlement, and I appreciate that.
Oh, absolutely. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gosar, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you are aware, the administration released a 100-day plan in April to address cybersecurity shortcomings within our electric grid. The plan tapped the Department of Energy as the lead for its implementation rather than the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or Cisa. Some experts like Damon Small, Technical Director of Security Consulting at NCC Group North America, has pointed out that while the current plan takes the generation and transmission of bulk power into consideration, it fails to consider distribution. Original equipment manufacturers, or OEMs, that supply industrial control systems should be a part of that conversation as well. Joe M. Weiss, a noted control system cybersecurity expert, argues that the real danger to the grid does not lie in the networks, but rather in the industrial controllers and the hardware, like the transformers and turbines, and that the electric grid is vulnerable to electronic triggers buried in bulk power equipment that is predominantly sourced from China. Contributing to this danger, engineers who manage the industrial control systems used to be responsible for their cybersecurity, but now have surrendered that function to computer engineers. Weiss argues that these systems are vulnerable from being disrupted by bad actors without the normal IT alerts being sounded. The Chinese government is installing a backdoor in a large transformer destined for a substation in Colorado. And the SolarWinds hack is proof of the supply chain attacks that were not quickly detected by IT network monitoring or threat intelligence. This needs to be our focus. Mr. Kumar, what percentage of the U.S. energy grid includes components manufactured overseas?
Sir, thank you for the question. And understanding the supply chain of our critical energy systems is very important to us. To that end, the president issued an executive order really focused on America's supply chains. And one of the key components of that is looking at those critical components like transformers, as you rightfully noted, that are so critical to the reliability of our electric grid, and where are we manufacturing a lot of those components. And one of the key things that we've seen with large power transformers, sir, you certainly recognize, is we don't manufacture large power transformers in the United States anymore. And that is a huge gap that we have as a country. And so that is something that we're certainly going to be looking at in terms of where are we producing a lot of these critical components on the U.S. In the U.S. energy sector as part of some of that report.
So to answer my question, zero are made here in the United States. They're in foreign countries, right?
So when you talk about large power transformers today, large power transformers are built abroad. You're absolutely right. But
so was it necessary for the Biden administration to suspend President Trump's EO restricting the procurement of foreign electric equipment. Couldn't Secretary Granholm have reviewed the executive order without suspending it? Mr. Kumar?
Thank you for that question, sir. Again, the supply chain security is a critical component of our energy sector, as I mentioned during my.
I understand, but isn't it, well, wouldn't it have been much better off that the secretary didn't suspend President Trump's initiative, because it would have helped us along this pathway?
Sir, what we found was we got feedback from the private sector that they were looking for additional clarification. And so one of the things that we've done is we want to take a more holistic approach. One of the other things that we took into account was we had solar winds happen last year. Solar winds really changed how we were thinking about supply chain threats across the board. And so what we wanted to do was have consistent policy that actually helped move the ball forward. And so this pause in that policy allowed us to seek input from the private sector, interagency, and others to really develop a stronger policy related to supply chain security. So that's where we're focused, and we just received input through our RFI process, and we're in the process of reviewing all of the RFIs so that we can come back with a stronger approach, and I'd be happy to follow up with you on that, sir.
Yeah, so I guess my point in time here is that, you know, we're suspending a lot of the necessary supply chains here in this country that can be manufactured, whether it be electronic pieces, whether it be the rare earths and copper manufacturing process pieces for these transformers and these big aspects. So, I mean, it seems like we're in a negative transfer abyss, that is, we're chasing our tail around and around and around. We don't have the supply chains. We don't have the critical elements to build them. We don't have the manufacturing to build them. This is a complex issue, and time is of the essence. And it doesn't seem like we're going to be getting anywhere quick unless we fast track this. Is that your understanding?
Sure. So in the interim, where we've been focused a lot of our efforts is working with manufacturers directly. So we just signed partnerships with ABB, Hitachi, Schneider, and Schweitzer, and they've come on board with DOE to test pieces of their equipment. Because the reality is a lot of this equipment, whether it's hardware or software, is sourced globally. And so what we really need to get to is really working with the manufacturers and suppliers to actually engineer out a lot of the cybersecurity concerns. So we actually have had a lot of positive success with those manufacturers to ensure that we can actually test their equipment down to the chip level and down to the firmware level. So we've had a lot of success on that, and we're going to continue to do that, and we look forward to participation by some of those other manufacturers to come to the table, whether they're manufacturers of large power transformers or SCADA equipment or relays. Those critical components, we want to partner with them. We want to help them really ensure that they know the pedigree of their software and hardware before this equipment ever gets deployed on our electric grid.
And one last question, Mr. Chairman. So what other agencies are we working with, or are we siloing this? It seems like this is a very complex issue that transcends different agencies. So isn't there a great process here to work functionally with all the agencies to have a cohesive, well-planned, thoughtful process?
Thank you for raising that. I think it's one of the reasons that the sector risk management agency structure works so well in this country. Because what happens is, if we're focused on something from an energy perspective, we want to ensure that our partners at Cisa are aware of those vulnerabilities and threats, because we want them to be looking at them across the board. We want them to be looking at chemical industrial control systems and industrial control systems in other sectors. So we partner very closely with our colleagues at Cisa. In fact, last year, actually earlier this year, we released a really critical vulnerability in relays that's being used in a specific manufacturer, and how we released it was in close coordination with our partners at Cisa to get the word out there once we had worked with the manufacturer to find a patch. So you're absolutely right that we need to be working collaboratively, and that's how we do it with Cisa, but we're also working with our colleagues at FERC to help inform their process. And then, of course, we work with the intelligence community, because we want them to know where are the threats, where are the risks in these critical components, so they can help us through their own missions to really help us address these risks.
I thank you, Mr. Kumar, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for your indulgence.
The gentleman yields back. Just a clarification on the gentleman's question and your answer. The large transformer manufacturers, who are no longer operating within the United States, are they U.S. companies or are they foreign companies?
Sir, it's a mixed bag in terms of
So we do have U.S. manufacturers that are manufacturing large transformers overseas.
So we have, for example, ABB, Hitachi.
Yeah.
They're producing more of the medium voltage transformers in the United States right now. And so there are some manufacturers that are making transformers in the United States. They're just not the large power transformers. And so one of the things that we would like to do is partner with them to really encourage a lot of this domestic manufacturing for those transformers. But there are other transformers that are being built by other countries out there as well. And I'd be happy to follow up with you with the list of those companies.
All right, thank you. I thank you very much. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Spear, for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me ask Mr. Kumar to begin. Since 85% of our U.S. electrical grid relies on parts and equipment from overseas, I mean, it's primed to be somehow manipulated or compromised as a result. And I know FERC has approved a new supply chain risk management reliability, but I don't know if it goes far enough. So first of all, let me ask you, Mr. Kumar, are you also working with the NSA and their interface with their corporate entities outside of the intelligence community?
Congresswoman, absolutely. We want to take a whole of government approach. These challenges, particularly when it comes to supply chain challenges, are too great. We have to be leveraging the authorities, the capabilities, and the expertise across the government. And so we're absolutely working on the intelligence side with our colleagues in the broader intelligence community, NSA certainly included, but also in terms of protecting critical infrastructure. This is where we need to be partnering with other agencies such as Cisa, who helps us all be connected in these efforts as we look at our supply chain. I do want to raise up an issue you mentioned, and I think it's an important one, and that's looking at a lot of our components and particularly just new components that we're putting out into the grid. This is where we think it's of the utmost importance to employ a philosophy in the United States of security by design. And the concept is we really need to be looking at the next generation systems. So to that end, what we've done is we've collaborated with DOE's Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy as we start to look at wind turbines, solar panels, nuclear generation, and of course, fossil energy. How do we ensure that the R&D being done on those systems has cybersecurity embedded into it? So this is a mandate that the Secretary Granholm has asked Cisa to lead across the board, that cyber is a core component of everything that the department does through the R&D at headquarters, but through our national laboratories as well.
Thank you. Mr. Goldstein, can you tell us about the programs that Cisa has undertaken to warn critical infrastructure owners and operators about risks specific to foreign-produced equipment and software?
Certainly. I thank you for that question. As my colleague at DOE noted, Cisa really focuses on understanding broad cross-sector risks to the nation's critical infrastructure in close collaboration with the SRMAs that bring unique sectoral expertise for entities within their purview. At Cisa, we manage the Information and Communications Technology Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force, which is a public-private body intended to bring together the producers and developers of much of the platform technologies that we see ubiquitously utilized across sectors in order to understand the risks posed by certain technologies and also, most critically, to drive best practices to reduce supply chain risk throughout the life cycle.
So here, excuse me, here's my question though. You could have the wherewithal to provide this support and information to these many operators around the country, but if they either don't know about it or don't avail themselves of it, they become that much more vulnerable to foreign attacks. So what are you doing to somehow lure them into a discussion and a training that will provide them that kind of information? And then secondly, have you created a list of banned foreign-produced equipment and software that is known to pose a threat to the U.S. critical infrastructure cybersecurity?
Certainly. As to the first question, our hope is that luring is not required. Our hope is that by communicating effectively with critical infrastructure across this country through the multiple information sharing groups that CISA administers in coordination with the SRMAs and our other partners in government, we are able to share timely and actionable information about vulnerable hardware and software that may need to either be mitigated or replaced. And our focus here really is on the vulnerabilities as opposed to the foreign provenance in the first instance. And by sharing information about vulnerable technology assets, that then enables an infrastructure owner-operator to take concrete steps to address a particular risk in their environment. To your second question, ma'am, there is not currently a list maintained by CISA of banned technology assets for critical infrastructure. It does bear noting that Congress recently created the FASC, which is an interagency body intended to assess the risk of foreign produced vulnerable devices in federal networks and has the authority to issue exclusion orders for those assets. That body is active now, and presumably an exclusion order issued by the FASC could be taken up by sectors across critical infrastructure or by sectoral regulators.
All right, thank you. Let me just conclude by urging all of you to recognize that we are the last to respond more often than not. Huawei was operational in this country for over 10 years before we finally got the message that they shouldn't be allowed to do so. ZTE is yet another example. We are very late in doing what we should do early on, and I just hope that you recognize your responsibility to act swiftly when there is either known or suspected foreign intrusions and or equipment that poses a problem to us. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Quote unquote, the front line.
Thanks for watching, and if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to our channel. And while you're at it, please leave us a comment. Thank you for watching.